Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Gelfand. I'm the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development in the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. And with me is Kim Leach, a principal also in the Office of the Auditor General and in my group in the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Developments group. We're really excited to be with you video-wise. We'd love to be with you in person, but Canada is just really far from the rest of the world. We always have to traverse an ocean, a big ocean, and so it just makes it much more difficult for us to be with you. However, Archana asked us to participate in the training session that you're working on in terms of auditing the SDGs, and we wanted to share our experience with you in the audit that we just tabled about 2 weeks ago.
April 24th.
Yeah, so very short, not too long ago. The first thing I want to say is just how excited I am that everybody around the world is working on the Sustainable Development Goals. These are really important United Nations goals that finally define what sustainable development is. And for those of you who may or may not be aware, in the Supreme Audit institutions within INTOSAI, Canada is the only office that actually has a Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development within the office of an SAI. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world within SAIs. There are other Commissioners of Environment and Sustainable Development, but they're not located in the SAI. So when I found out that INTOSAI was interested in working on the SDGs, and given that it's in my title, Sustainable Development Commissioner, I obviously got very excited about this initiative, and we will be telling you a little bit about what we're doing. So today we're going to just tell you a little bit about the Commissioner's Office, and we're going to tell you a little bit about what our early work that we did on the SDGs, and Kim will tell you most about the actual audit that we did on whether or not Canada is prepared to implement the 2030 Agenda.
Yep, sounds great.
So, the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development was established in 1995 as an amendment to the Auditor General's Act. And the interesting thing is that I report my audits directly to Parliament, just like the Auditor General does. My audits, though, are usually focused on issues related to environment and sustainable development. And as we all know now with the 17 goals, that pretty much includes almost everything that an SAI may do. So we have issued, it's got to be about 6 reports a year since 1995 on all kinds of topics from toxic chemicals to pipeline industry. We just did one on aquaculture. We're doing one on invasive species. And Kim has done many of them on the climate change file. I also have 2 other responsibilities, which is to monitor the implementation of the Canadian Sustainable Development Strategy, as well as departmental sustainable development strategies, and we manage the environmental petitions process. Do you want to say just a few words about that?
Sure. So the environmental petitions process is a process whereby any Canadian can write a letter to the Auditor General or the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, and they're mandated by law to receive a response to that petition within 120 days from the responsible federal minister. So we have about almost 500 petitions that are on our OAG website, and so we have all the petitions and all the responses there on a variety of topics: climate change, environmental assessment,
nuclear.
Yeah, lots of good information, lots of great questions that Canadians have asked and that have official responses from ministers. So it's a great process. I also want to add one little thing, Julie, just that Canada is also a proud member of the INTOSAI Working Group on Environmental Auditing, and has been since its inception in 1995 as well, I believe. And we were chair of that for a number of years, and Indonesia is currently the chair, and we still do a lot of work, and we're a steering committee member, and very proud of the work that the Working Group on Environmental Auditing has done as well.
Yeah. I believe the Office of the Auditor General is a member of several different INTOSAI working groups, but the one that the Commissioner's been involved in for the last 20 years is the Working Group on Environmental Audit. So we're going to tell you a little bit about what we did as soon as INTOSAI adopted the SDGs as part of their strategic plan. You know that they adopted 4 approaches. And so we started looking at what have we done in terms of SDG work. And we went backwards, I believe almost 15 years, and looked at the audits we had done, and we actually went to see whether or not we could link them to a specific SDG. So for example, this is just one example of a chart that we completed, where you can see that we've done approximately 47 audits in the area of SDG 3, but only 2 audits in the area of SDG 7. So it was a way of trying to show the rest of the office, not just the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development Group, but the whole office, what it is that they were doing already and how that could contribute to the area of the SDGs.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so the idea as well is to, and it was between 2000 and 2016 that this sort of sample was drawn from, and we really wanted to see, as Julie said, you know, where are we covering the Sustainable Development Goals, targets, and indicators, and where do we have work to do for the future? So this was a way of figuring out what we have done and where, in fact, we want to go for the future. So it's been very helpful.
Yeah, so that's pretty much, I think, the first thing that we did after Intosai adopted it. These are some of the other things we did. So the first thing we did was consider the past audits, just like we said, and their relationship to the SDGs to identify gaps. We also commented on the draft Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, and we recommended that they integrate the SDGs. So this happened in 2016, which we found very interesting. We received an audit, we received the draft Federal Sustainable Development Strategy from the Canadian government a year after they signed on to the SDGs, and nowhere in the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy draft did we see any mention of the Sustainable Development Goals. So my first question back to them was, well, how does this Canadian the federal strategy on sustainable development, how come it's not linked to the SDGs? So when we received the final copy, a few months later, the Canadian government had placed in the SDGs and started to mention these. So that's probably the second thing we did. Kim, do you want to talk about the third one?
So we have a guide in our office. It's available on our intranet. So we call it the ENSD guide. And really, Julie's group, we do environment sustainable development audits. But of course, the rest of the audit does audits on different topics. You know, health, defense.
Indigenous
issues.
Military.
So we also have a requirement, I guess, that all other audit teams also consider environment sustainable development issues. So we've, and this has been in place for a number of years, but we've updated this guide to include the Sustainable Development Goals. And really what this means is that it's not just environmental auditors that are looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and considering how they relate to their audits. It's also all other teams within the office. So this guide is a way that those teams can understand the Sustainable Development Goals and environmental audit and how they can help integrate the SDGs into their own work.
Then the next one is on audit training, which you should talk about.
So it's actually related to the guide as well. So you know, these goals are still relatively new to to Canadians and to auditors. So we've developed some training that we are actually giving to the auditors. So it's actually some training that's helping to implement the guide that I just spoke about.
So the next thing we did was I asked all the principals in the office. There's about 15 different principals who run different teams in all these areas. 3 are in the commissioners group, but the other 12 work for the Auditor General. So I actually asked each of the principals to have a look at the SDGs. What did they think were the highest risk SDGs to Canada? Whether or not they thought we should audit these areas and when they should audit that. So we should be getting information from that survey of all the principals sometime toward the end of May of this year, and that will help feed into the report that we give to the side event for the high-level political forum that we'll be attending this July. The other thing we did was the office actually prepares a sustainable development strategy for the Office of the Auditor General. And our sustainable development strategy is now completely linked to the SDGs, both for the performance audit side and also for the financial audit side. So we have presented to the financial auditors how important their work is to achieving SDG 16, for example, and how they play a really important role in things like preventing bribery and corruption in Canada. Part of that's their link into the SDGs. So that was something else that we did to try and infiltrate the SDGs into the entire office. And finally, the thing that you're all working on, the performance audit on our government's preparedness to implement the SDGs. So just quickly, the commissioner, our office, has decided that we will be responsible for approach 1 within INTOSI. We will be helping to bring together all these audits that you are working on to whether or not governments are ready to implement the SDGs, and we will be bringing that together in order to present it back to the SDGs. And I'm sure you're very aware of the 7 steps. So I'll let Kim talk about how she adapted these 7 steps and talk about our audit.
Sure. So we actually tabled our audit on April 24th, just a few weeks ago. And the period that our audit covered was October 2015, which is when Canada signed on to the resolution, the UN resolution to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, or to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. And the end of our audit was in November 2017. And that's quite important to emphasize because there is a lot still going on in Canada, as we will hear at the end of, when I talk about the end of our audit process. We understand that the government is still planning some important action and has taken important action since the end of our audit period. So I'll get to that in a minute. But we included 7 federal organizations in our audit. The first 5 are tasked to lead the Government of Canada's approach on sustainable development goals. The last 2 are important organizations who also help establish mechanisms, governance mechanisms. The Privy Council Office and Statistics Canada is very important for the measuring, monitoring, and reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've included 7 organizations.
However, when we first started this audit, Kim failed to mention, I recall that I picked up the phone and phoned somebody in Global Affairs Canada, which had been the lead for the Millennium Development Goals, and I said, hey, just want to let you know that we're going to come in and audit whether or not you're prepared to implement the SDGs. And there was basically a big pause on the phone, and then I got a, thank you very much, Madam Commissioner, and the person hung up. Essentially, when we first indicated that we were going to be auditing this, the government really had not done a lot. They hadn't even identified who the leads were. So in terms of value added to doing this audit, if we hadn't made that phone call, if we hadn't told them that we were coming in to audit their preparedness, frankly, I'm not sure that any of what Kim found would have actually happened. Is that safe?
Yep, and you know, there was a change of government we had in October 2015, which you know, it may have taken things a while to get going, but even you know, further as we'll see, we found a lot of things you know, were not present during our audit, and we feel that you know, that the Government of Canada is not prepared. The conclusion of our audit is the Government of Canada is not prepared to implement the Sustainable Development Goals as of November 2017. You want me to just take a look at this? Sure. So this is a little graphic that we developed that represents the 7 steps. So the 7 steps that you know that IDI and other countries have been using, we adopted those as part of our audit expectations, I guess, for government. So as you can see, there's 7 of them. An important thing, and just in terms of some suggestions that we would have for you who are doing audits, is we adapted these 7 steps to be relevant to the Canadian context. So, for example, under establishing governance, we have Canadian criteria that talk about when you're undertaking a horizontal initiative, it's important to have a governance structure with lead departments responsible and roles and responsibilities identified, for example. So although the 7 steps are very important, we also had to develop, Canada's central criteria and expectations in order to effectively audit this.
Kim, when you're talking about horizontal, you're actually meaning the whole of government.
Right, whole of government.
Whole of government,
Yeah.
so.
And, establishing governance, we did expect a whole of government approach, and I think that is also discussed in the resolution, because the SDGs, as Julie explained, cover all aspects.
So does Canada actually have criteria that we can use on whole of government approaches?
Yeah, we have a results-based accountability framework that is suggested when you are, by the Government of Canada, by a Treasury Board, when you're looking at horizontal initiatives. So that was one of the expectations that we had as to why a governance mechanism, governance structure was important.
So what we could do is maybe send a link to that information to
If that's
everybody else, just to see, so we can share that with other people.
Sure, yep,
Yeah.
but it's important that each country develop their own
Yeah.
expectations, based on these steps. Yeah, so maybe
Next.
the next one, I think, would show the results of our work. So these are, again, on the first column, these are the 7 steps. And, the first one is commitment and responsibility. So we did find that, our own federal government had committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. It had adopted the resolution in 2015, along with 93 other countries. And the Prime Minister actually at the UN last summer made some commitments and statements that contributed as well to that federal government commitment to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. They only get 1 green star there, though, because we did find that sustainable development, Julie described the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, and it is very focused on environment. We found that it could be more broadly defined to include social and economic matters as well. And we've made that observation in our audit. The second thing is establishing governance. So, we found that there was no federal government structure that identified a lead department responsible. In fact, there are 5 departments that are leading, as we described earlier, and Julie has described that.
I talked about it as trying to drive a car with 10 hands on the steering wheel. I mean, I'm not sure how you do that. 5 lead departments doesn't sound reasonable. I think you need to have a leader.
Yeah. So we have made that recommendation that a governance structure be established with a clear lead, and government has accepted our recommendation, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So again, that was something that was lacking in our audit. We found lacking engagement and consulting. So we found that there's no federal government structure, so it's not surprising there's no federal communications plan and/or engagement strategy. And why this is really important is because, as we know, implementing the Sustainable Development Goals is going to require the participation of all Canadians, all levels of government, civil society, Indigenous communities. So everybody needs to contribute, and if they don't know about it and they haven't been engaged and consulted, it's difficult to get that direction. So that hasn't been done. However, departments that we audited get a green star there, because departments individually have started to do some things. We have a feminist international assistance policy that Global Affairs Canada has been working on. We have a homeless strategy that our one of our departments is working on. So department by department, there are things going on, but more generally, the federal government itself has not engaged Canadians on the Sustainable Development Goals. The third thing that we expected is an implementation plan. So it's important to have an implementation plan that takes the Sustainable Development Goals and targets and indicators and turns them into national targets and goals. And we found that that had not been done. And not surprisingly, if there's no governance structure and no communication strategy, also no implementation plan there. Measuring, monitoring, and reporting, also very important. As we know, the Sustainable Development Goals really emphasize this, which is great because the Millennium Development Goals previously had not focused on that. So we're very happy that that's part of this Sustainable Development Goals. But and StatsCan, our statistical commission, has done some excellent work in terms of developing a data framework. I mean, this is not an easy task. There's lots of information required, and sometimes things are even defining things in terms of trying to measure them is difficult. So they've done some good work there, and they've got some data that they've compiled. However, they still have not measured, what that information is in its entirety. So there's some more work to be done there.
So overall, we found that the Government of Canada was not adequately prepared to implement the 2030 agenda, and we presented this to Parliament just a week ago, and we had members of the government asking me questions. Well, it would seem to me Canada scores pretty high on the OECD list when compared to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's correct. And then they started telling me about all the good work that they were doing and how that links back to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I recognize, of course, Canada scores high, highly developed country, but there are pockets, subpopulations where I don't think that Canada would score all that well. So treatment of our Aboriginal people, for example, is a good example. But also what I said to the government was that the SDGs require you to look not at what you're doing and linking it back to the SDGs, but that you have to look at the SDGs, decide what's high risk for your country, and then what are your national targets and how are you going to reach those. So rather than saying, here's what we do already and link it back to the SDGs, we should be looking at the SDGs and saying, where do we have problems and what are we going to do, what are our targets, and how are we going to reach them. So the government did accept all of our recommendations, and then Kim can talk about, as I said earlier, when we started the audit, pretty much nothing was going on. I remember the audit team coming in to me saying, we feel like we're auditing a cloud. There's actually nothing to audit. There was no activity going on. But because of our audit, a lot of things did happen, and the last thing that happened was what Kim can talk about.
Sure. So as I said, our audit ended in November 2017. In March 2018, the federal government issued its budget for the year, and there was some money that was identified to establish a Sustainable Development Goals unit and to do some additional work in Statistics Canada in terms of measuring, monitoring, and reporting. So that's good news. We don't know exactly what it all means.
And we haven't audited
how
it.
This is going to happen, and it exactly. The other thing that was announced just on later in April, it was April 17th actually, so just before we tabled the audit report, government again issued a media advisory, saying that it was going to develop a national plan, it was going to have a communication strategy, it was going to have an engagement strategy. So, this is still coming. The government accepted all of our recommendations, which were around those things. So we're still watching and waiting, and are happy to see that there's been some movement there.
Okay, so thank you very much. That's the end of our presentation on our audit on preparedness of the Canadian government to implement the SDGs, along with some of the other work that our office is doing on the SDGs. Archana sent us a few questions that she asked us to answer for you. So the first one is, based on your experience of auditing preparedness for implementation of SDGs, what advice or tips, do's and don'ts, would you give to the SAI teams that are currently engaged in such an audit?
Sure. Okay. So the first thing I would say, and we've already talked about it a little bit, but having the 7 steps was very, very helpful, having international sort of guidance to help develop criteria. But it's also really important to make sure that you translate those into national criteria. So information that that is applicable to your own country, to your own government. Very important to be able to walk into a department and say, the reason you need a governance strategy is because your own government indicates that is something that should happen. So very important to translate international, very helpful to have international criteria, but also important to have the national translation of that. The other thing that I would say is that it was sometimes we would ask a department what they were doing to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and they would come up with a list of things that they were already doing. That is great, because there's certainly things that are important that are already going on. But it wasn't until we started asking the questions on what are you doing differently as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals being in place, and how are you going beyond what you're already doing in order to prepare for and to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So going beyond that was important.
And how are you integrating all three aspects of sustainable development would be part of that, I would think, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing you may want to talk about a bit more, Julie, but how even doing the audit alone had a significant impact, as we talked about earlier.
I agree. So when we started the audit, we found that there was not much happening within the Canadian government. We know that the audit had huge value because the lead departments hadn't been identified when we first started the audit. You were auditing a cloud. It was frustrating. But in the end, over the period of the audit, all of a sudden we had leads identified and we had some money announced, and the government did make a commitment to an engagement strategy. So I think just doing the audit had huge impact.
Yeah.
The second question was, what are your plans for following up on this preparedness report? So I'll let Kim start and add in.
Sure. So we do have something planned for 2020. We haven't scoped the audit fully yet, but we are looking at following up on the recommendations that we made. We made 4 recommendations as a result of the audit that we presented here today. So we'll be following up on that, looking at the governance structure established and the consultation mechanisms, for example. But we also are interested in looking perhaps at some other things, including we're very interested in the idea of policy coherence, which is important for implementing Sustainable Development Goals. So the extent to which environment, social issues, and economic issues are considered together in decisions that are made by the Government of Canada. So we're interested in that, and that will be a sort of a government-wide audit in 2020. But beyond that, we do hope to look at specific goals and how specific departments are implementing the goals and targets and indicators that are important to them.
Right, which we mentioned already, trying to get the whole Office of the Auditor General of Canada, including the financial auditors, sort of SDG'd is the way I describe it. Mm-hmm. The last question is, what are your plans for engaging with SDGs and using the whole of government approach in the long term? So I feel like Kim might have already answered that. So we need to look at, Archana even said it to us in a phone call that we had with her recently, that there was a difference between auditing an SDG in a particular area versus actually auditing the SDG from an inclusive whole of government perspective. And we know that some people in the Working Group on Environmental Audit are working on this, and we will be following that. The whole idea of trying to audit policy coherence at a whole of government level would be another part to that. But the second thing I wanted to talk about was just the public engagement. When we delivered our report, we hosted a webinar on the day that it was tabled. And the day that it was tabled, there was also a conference in Canada on implementing the SDGs. It was a civil society conference. And our webinar fed in live into their conference. So we know that the stakeholders who are thinking about SDGs are aware of our work. And we've been asked to speak on that, and we think that will continue over the next little while. So with that, we'll end our presentation. We salute you all. We wish you the best of luck in implementing your audits. And if you have any further questions, please get them through Archana, and we'll do our best to answer them. So on behalf of Kim and I, thank you and all the best.